Hey guys, today I'm doing a power jack replacement on a Lenovo IdeaPad 3, the 15-inch version. This is not the Idea Gaming Pad 3, that's another video that I have as well already up, so it can be kind of confusing, but this is the small little circular pin versus that square Lenovo pin that the gaming one has. But the first step here is to remove the bottom cover. There's a bunch of screws you want to remove. And once these screws are removed, you can take a pry tool. I prefer a thin little guitar pick to go around the edges of that bottom cover, and that'll kind of pry it up a little bit to get that bottom cover removed. This one comes up relatively easily. Just put some pressure with one hand like I'm doing, and then continue to use that guitar pick across it. Alright, the first thing I want to do here is disconnect the battery. You never know if this thing's in standby or something like that. You want to make sure the battery's disconnected before you start working on it. Sometimes you have to remove the battery on these, and sometimes they can stay in place if they're not blocking any cables or anything like that. And here I'm going to remove the wireless card. There's a single screw that holds that in. I'm actually going to try to leave the leads on this case. Sometimes I take them off if I have to. If I can leave them on, they can be kind of a pain, especially for someone who doesn't do this all the time, to get them off and back on again. So you can leave it on in the case of this model. And here it looks like I'm detaching the fan cable, and I'm going to remove the fan screws. Taking that fan out of there, and then I'm just detaching a couple of the cables here. One's to the I/O board, and then one's looks like to the power button. Detaching the backlight, the keyboard. All these connectors flip up to unlock and flip back down to lock, so be careful, don't remove them all the way. And then I'm just detaching a speaker here, and here I'm detaching the LED cable. And here I'm just removing some screws that are on the hinge. So on some of these laptop models, the hinge will go over the motherboard, so you can remove those hinge screws and then you just pry up a little bit on the laptop like I'm doing here. And then after you pry up a little bit on the laptop, you can pull up on the hinge, and then that'll give access to the motherboard. And here I'm just removing some motherboard screws. And now the motherboard's coming out there. There's one cable tucked underneath there, you gotta be careful. I think that's the touchpad. So you just flip that connector up, unlock it, that'll come out. And so now we have access to this power jack. As you can see, it's that circular kind, the more traditional, versus the Lenovo square plug like on the IdeaPad 3 Gaming. So now it's just time to remove the power jack and put a new one on. Alright, now we got the power jack ready to go, the motherboard out, ready to start desoldering. And the first step here, I like to add flux to each one of the through holes. This is going to help break up that solder, going to help remove everything much easier. You can theoretically do it without flux, and some of the braids that they advertise have flux in them, but I always find it's much easier to add flux, as well as the flux from the solder and the flux from the braid. And here I'm just adding solder to the existing through holes first. This really helps break up the solder, gets that solder in that through hole flowing so it can come out much easier when it's time to desolder. And so now I'm going to take my desoldering braid. I'm going to start going over each one of these through holes to try to remove as much solder as possible. And I'm using a Hakko FX888D soldering iron, about 750 degrees roughly. Pretty typical temps. It's a nice mid-range soldering iron. Using a chisel tip versus that pointy tip, I really don't like those. I prefer the chisel tip versus the pointy one. It's really good for these through holes that are kind of squares or rectangles, and you can hold that chisel tip on there, at all four sides of that through hole and just help get the solder out. And if this is something that's beyond your tech savvy level, this is something that I advertise as a service for $69 parts and labor on the IdeaPad 3. Alright, so now I'm going to flip the motherboard over. I'm going to try to desolder a little bit on this side. This is always helpful, if you try to attack it from both sides. Sometimes you can get some extra solder out on the other side to help break everything out. And here I'm just taking some 99% alcohol, just going to clean this thing up a little bit, get the flux off of there. Then here I'm taking some thermal tape. I'm going to use the hot air station to finish the removal of the jack. Taking that thermal tape and just putting it over the sensitive surface mount components that could be damaged by using hot air. Alright, now I got the hot air station going. This is really helpful. I've just noticed that with the jacks, over the years, I've been doing this since 2006, and over the years these things just have gotten harder and harder to remove, and I just have moved towards that air station for that final removal of the jack. If I had to, I could spend more time, try to get more solder out, try to coax it out of there, but it's just much easier to try to use this hot air station. And they're not expensive. You can get one for like 60 to 90 bucks. And it just makes this entire process much easier on you. And less risk to damaging the motherboard too, which is always good. I'm holding about half inch away from the board, just trying to evenly apply heat over those solder points. And it's a pretty thin motherboard, pretty thin jack, so the solder, you can see in the video, is already starting to flow a little bit. And that thing's going to come off pretty quick here, which is great. And if you can see, a part of the jack is still stuck in there. That's probably where the break was, that the customer was experiencing. Probably able to wiggle that thing just the right way to make it have contact. But once I remove the jack, you kind of see where it's broken. I'm just going to finish heating this thing up here and grab that out with the tweezers. And now it's time to remove the tape and finish the desoldering of these through holes. So I'm just going to add some flux to each one of those holes and start the desoldering process again. So I'm just taking the tweezers here, I'm just pushing some of that solder through. Some of this solder is really pesky, it just doesn't want to come up. So you can take a tweezers, or depending on the size of the through hole, like a small screwdriver flathead, I've done in some of my other videos, and you kind of push that solder through to the other side. You want to be extremely careful though when you're doing that. You can damage the motherboard if you're not careful. Definitely have to know what you're doing. And here I'm just going to add some more flux again. Now that I flipped the motherboard over, I'm going to start the desoldering on the other side. You just want to try different angles of that soldering tip to try to get that through hole heated up. Sometimes you'll put the soldering iron on there and nothing's happening, nothing's coming up. You kind of have to wiggle it around, as you can see me doing in the video. A little bit of wiggling, a little bit of moving of the angle to try to get that right sweet spot of the soldering iron, making contact properly and heating up that through hole. And I'm even taking my chisel tip and I'm kind of, trying to like dig it in that hole a little bit just to get that hole heated up really good. Trying another angle here. And this can be really tricky, man, flipping the board back over again, doing the tweezer poking trick. It's just, sometimes the solder just does not want to come out, so don't get discouraged. You kind of have to be persistent with it. Never push too hard on the iron, though. Never push too hard on the tweezers. You don't want to, really apply any real pressure or, real pushing of that through hole with the tweezers of the iron. That's a good way to damage that through hole or damage the motherboard. So another trick too is just add more solder. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but here on that through hole that's being really pesky, I just added a full, dose of solder to get all the way into that through hole again. Kind of hopefully, and with the hopes of that some of that solder kind of soaking up the stuff that won't come, and then adding flux again and trying to redo that hole. So sometimes it doesn't work perfectly the first time, and you have to add some solder and flux again and go about it again. This can be really tedious. There, I'm just trying to get as much solder out and then trying to do some poking while it's still warm or kind of flowing a little bit. And then flip the motherboard back over after I kind of poked it with the tweezers and try to get some more of that solder out of there with the braid. And the more you poke it through, you can just keep poking one side, flip it, try to desolder, poke it again, flip it, desolder. And now this thing's ready for a new jack. I just put the pliers under there to keep it flush with the motherboard. If you don't have something underneath supporting it, that jack can kind of go off center, not stick well. And so just having something supported beneath it can be important. You don't want to solder that thing at an angle or have one of the pins hanging down or lagging on one side. You want to make sure that thing's nice and flush with the board. And I'm just going to add some solder to each one of the through holes here. And here I'm just adding some extra flux, just helping that solder flow through the through hole all the way. Just like the desoldering process, the soldering process is similar in the fact that you need to kind of go over it a couple times, add some more flux, add some more solder, just make sure it's flowing through on each side. And also like the desoldering, I like to sometimes, depending on the way it's going, I'll flip the motherboard over and try to do some soldering on that side too. Just to give it some extra support. This jack is a little bit flimsy in general, so it's kind of a good example of one I like to flip over and try to do soldering on the other side too. I'm just going to add some flux. Some of the solder probably isn't flowing the best through that other side, so adding some flux and then some more heat from the soldering iron will help that solder flow through. Got to make sure you have a clean tip. And just a little bit of excess solder there that came on, so I just like to remove that. No big deal. And just taking some more of my 99% alcohol, just going to clean this thing up. Make it look nice. Get rid of that old dirty flux. And now we got the new jack installed and it's ready to put back into the laptop. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you have any questions, just leave me a comment.